Sometimes Mr. Ocamp, I didn't see him. Mr. Ocamp's picture is sometimes not correct, but he doesn't see one, even in the NCOP setting. His video doesn't look okay all the time.
Good morning, Mr. Ocamp, Mr. Ryder, and Mr. Detroit.
Good morning.
Good morning,
can you please
honorable members. I think Mr. Mbava is sorted now.
Good morning, Mr. Ryder. How are you, Honorable Ryder?
Wabona tsotsi uya gaute ngwira. O shapa ka di gaminwane.
Honorable Ryder, I want to see you. May I please see you, sir? I know.
It normally costs dinner and a movie.
Me and Honorable Ryder, we are good friends. He is not going to refuse.
What are you saying about the movies, Ryder? Dennis?
If he can switch on,
the video.
I'm saying it normally costs dinner and a movies to see me, Chairperson. Now the ladies must stand in the queue, take a number. Come on.
I took you for dinner. Yes, you see yourself. That's cool. I don't know why Honorable Ryder doesn't have a background, but we shall sort it out. I've got his number. Yeah, Honorable Ryder. Yeah, that's cool. I know you are clever, Namus. We are good friends. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you so much.
Chairperson, you may please take over and start your meeting. Thanks.
Okay, can you flag the agenda? Mama. Good morning, honorable members. You are most welcome. Let me take this opportunity to officially open the meeting and welcome you. Appreciate your presence for being here. Made to understand that I think other stakeholders have been invited. Lubabalo, do we have we invited members from the provinces? Not at this stage.
No, not for this meeting, Chairperson.
Okay, but we usually allow them to participate. I mean, to join the meeting if they need to, because they are part of us. We don't deny them the opportunity to be on the platform. Let me also welcome Team FFC, which is going to do the presentation. Team PBO also is going to do the presentation. And these two institutions or entities are the focus of today. And members have received their presentations or documentation from the two institutions. And let me extend my welcome and appreciation from all the stakeholders of ourselves. That's media, our colleagues in different units from Parliament. You're all welcome in this meeting. There's a request also from communications from Parliament that our meeting is going to be live on all platforms. There'll be co-sharing or exchanging in terms of viewing on different channels, but we must always know that we might be on the screens for quite some time. I know the challenge that we are facing in terms of our network or connectivity, but nevertheless, I request that if possible, please open your video when you speak so that you can be well captured. Thank you. With those words, I want to welcome everybody and request the Secretariat to deal with the apologies.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, honorable members and colleagues. Chairperson, we received 2 apologies. Honorable Mama Rahane and Honorable Njado, they are currently attending WIP's forum meeting, but they will join the committee later on, Chairperson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
WIP's forum, but Honorable Detroit is here, he's also WIP. Or maybe it's
Honorable Dudoit, you know him, he's a special breed. He doesn't mind joining using 2 gadgets and attending meetings at the
He's multitasking.
You know him, yes.
Okay. I'm also going to request members who are on the platform to please rename your gadgets so that we know exactly who is here, because there are gadgets that I'm told they are named as numbers and they are no names. And initially, I think the host was not supposed to accept or allow you to join. We really emphasize that we should not hide our identity. And if you don't know how to do it, just call and you'll be assisted to rename your gadget. Thank you very much. Who's going to lead the FFC? Mr. Mvava, I think he was still driving. I don't know if he's in the office already.
Dr. Mbava, I've just accepted the commissioner now, Chairperson. I'm sure she's in the correct gadget for now.
Is he the one who's going to lead the presentation?
I'm sure Dr. Mbava is leading the delegation, but the commissioner will probably delegate to Mr. Tseng to do the presentation, to lead the presentation as they have normally done. But I will hand over to you, Chairperson, so that you can invite the doc to speak for my.
Dr. Mbava, are you settled?
Yes, I'm available, Chairperson. Thank you so much.
Okay, over to your team then.
Thank you so much, Chairperson, and thank you to the committee for inviting the Financial and Fiscal Commission to comment on the Special Appropriation Bill and the second appropriation bill as well. Chairperson, I have commissioners on the platform as well who are with me, and I also have the researchers led by our research head, Mr. Chen Sang. I will come in, Chairperson, at the end with the final comments on the presentation, and I now wish to hand over to the head of research of the FFC to give an extensive analysis of our presentation, Chairperson.
Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Chan.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good morning, honorable members. Today, our focus is rightfully on the Appropriation Bill and Adjustment Appropriation Bill of 2022, and seeing that our structure, it's the components of a broader picture that is our budget. So I shall be flying through the first three sections of the presentation done before, and instead focus by talking about some of the more recent developments in the world affecting our economy and our financial and fiscal outlook. So since our last engagement, honorable chair members, our economy outlook, unfortunately, on the horizon has taken a turn for the worse. And this time it is arguably man-made. What I mean by that, so look to the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve has decided to increase interest rates and announced that it will shrink its portfolio of investments in the world as its policy stance to combat inflation, they said. Following in its footstep in the wrong direction, the Bank of England also increased its rates. Our research at the Commission observes this great reversal in monetary policy globally and domestically with disappointment, as we think it might be first an error in their judgment and misapplication of financial and fiscal policies at the worst time possible. And second, and this is where domestically speaking more important, is this imposition and repercussions of these global policy decision errors on and its impact on emerging economies such as South Africa. So first and foremost, monetary policy is only effective against demand pull inflation, whereas our evidence of the COVID lockdowns around the world that we've seen, disrupted and broken supply chains, and the evidence of the war and sanctions in the Northern Hemisphere points squarely at not a demand pull inflation, but rather a supply push inflation. So essentially, it's the wrong monetary tool for a problem that is not that the tool is not fitted for. Second, as our South African financial system is intricately linked to the financial markets of the world, investments, the rate hike in arguably the most risk-free investments, that is the advanced economies, the US and the UK's investments and bonds. South African Reserve Bank has no alternatives but to follow suit, to raise our interest rates. Last week happened as it happened, and faster still going forward to maintain. Why are they doing that? It's to maintain the risk and reward differentials and parity, to avoid a capital flight and depreciation of our South African rand to those safer, higher yielding destinations in the advanced economy. So it is imposed upon us. Unfortunately, this monetary position that is being taken by the world central banks and then therefore ours. Unfortunately, our monetary policy is really no place for the contrarians, as we so clearly learn from Turkey, who reduced its interest rates without paying attention to its foreign currency reserves, trade terms, and balance of payments, disregarding its domestic inflation and excess liquidity, only now to feel the chronic and insurmountable pain as this Turkish lira depreciated. The pass-through effects kicks in. Turkey's inflation now is rising to 70% annual inflation rate. And that is no way for the economy to survive on at that rate of change in the prices. In sum, Honorable Chairperson and members, there's little doubt that more pain will be felt throughout the economy, and that our fiscal base, our economy, and more importantly, employment, jobs, and productivity must be bolstered. And that is the macro picture I wish to paint for you as context to this submission, especially now moving, let me hand over to Sasha Peters to take you through the appropriation bill and the adjustments appropriation bill, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair, members of the committee and other colleagues. As Jane mentioned, the next few slides will hone in on highlights from the 2022 appropriation bill and the second adjustments appropriation bill. So in total, the 2022 appropriation bill will allocate just over R1 trillion across the 41 votes for the 2022-23 financial year. And compared to the revised estimate for 2021-22, this represents an increase of 3%. So that's looking back. However, looking forward, we see that the positive growth that is being projected for 2022 is not likely to be maintained in 2023, when departments are again set to feel the pinch through reductions and or slower growth. If we look at that trillion rand that is being appropriated through the Appropriations Bill, and we look at it in terms of the economic classification components, we see that transfers and subsidies to provinces, municipalities, and other government agencies is the largest type of spending. It accounts for 71% of spending. And this, of course, emphasizes the fact that in our three-sphere system, it is the subnational governments and other government agencies that are the main service delivery implementers. The second largest item from an economic classification perspective is current payments at 259 billion. And this is predominantly used to pay the cost of employees. So 69% of that 259 billion is in respect of COE. And then when we look at this bill by vote, the largest allocation, as members all know, is across the largest allocation of all the national votes is the social development vote. And there are three key developments that are driving the increases in the social development vote. The first is the extension of the social relief of distress grant, which is being extended for another 12 months and will cost the fiscus around 44 billion. The second development is the adjustment to the child support grant, which will be expanded to include double orphans. And then the third development will be the linking of the social security grants to inflation. Generally, the Commission supports these interventions to bring relief to the poor and vulnerable who rely on social security grants, especially given the detrimental effects of the COVID-19 pandemic over the past 2 or so years. In terms of the timing of these developments, we know that the SRD grant is set to stop in March 2023, while the last two developments, which is the linking of the grants to inflation and the extension of the child support grant, that will be implemented as of the 2023-24 financial year. Regarding the permanent replacement for the SRD grant, the Commission notes the processes underway to identify a sound alternative. And for the Commission, one of the central considerations that should be kept in mind when evaluating the viability of any replacement is the long-run effect that it would have on the sustainability of the fiscus. If we move to the next slide, please. The other area of funding that has benefited from the revenue windfall is higher education, where an additional 32.6 billion will be transferred through this vote to the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. And the funding will be used to continue funding existing bursary holders, as well as funding for new entrants into the system. And here the Commission would like to highlight the fact that the provision of bursaries to existing and new students is not a temporary once-off type of support. It does create a future funding obligation at the very least over the short to medium term. And we therefore believe that due consideration must be given to government's ability to sustain this level of funding over the medium term, especially given the forecasts of reductions in 2023. If revenue does not recover, the implication is that the Department of Higher Education and Training budget will come under severe pressure come 2023-24. We do, however, note that according to the 2022 budget review, a new higher education funding model is set to be introduced in 2023. So the Commission will thus await the contents of that new funding model. In terms of basic education, it's another key vote. We note nominal increases over the next 3 years. But of course, what is more important is what happens at the provincial education level, since that is where the delivery of basic education is located. And to this end, the Commission welcomes the additional funding in the sector, which is aimed at assisting provinces with addressing the shortage of teachers. But again, as with the point made with the higher education vote, once teachers are hired, a future expenditure obligation is created. And should there be slower growth or reductions, then the basic education sector will be under pressure. The other development in the basic education sector is the shifting of the early childhood development function from the Department of Social Development to the Department of Basic Education. Research supports the positive spillovers of investing in quality early learning programs. And now that ECD will be part of the formal schooling system, the Commission strongly recommends that early learning be afforded the priority that it deserves. Then the other large increase is with respect to the cooperative governance vote. It's the increases there is one of the key drivers of growth in total allocation by vote. An additional funding of 28.9 billion is allocated to this vote, and it will largely be directed at transfers to municipalities in the form of the local equitable share allocation. And given the role of municipalities in the delivery of free basic services to indigent households, the Commission supports the protection of this funding. Now moving to the next slide, please. Alongside the increased funding for social protection programs, government has also utilized the additional revenue to improve funding to economic development departments. And this funding is largely in respect of infrastructure investment, thus reaffirming government's infrastructure-led approach to stimulating growth. And the notable allocations in this regard include an additional 5.3 billion to the water and sanitation vote. And this is largely to fund regional bulk infrastructure. And then there's also an addition of around 45.3 billion to the transport vote. And this is allocated in order to address the backlog in upgrading and refurbishing the national non-toll road network. And on both these aspects, we know that water is critical for health reasons as well as economic development. Likewise, with transport, a good road infrastructure facilitates trade of goods and is also critical for economic growth and development. So on both aspects, the Commission supports the targeting of funding towards these two votes. The key, however, will be the rollout of these infrastructure projects. As members are probably all too well aware, infrastructure management is a challenge, and it can inhibit the possible gains that can be derived from infrastructure investment. Then with respect to job creation, the allocations are spread across a number of national departments, including trade, industry and competition, as well as the employment and labor votes. Generally on this issue, the Commission notes that the various job creation initiatives have produced job opportunities, and this of course provides income relief for the recipients. However, these initiatives have not really changed the macro picture of unemployment, thus underlining the need for government to address the underlying structural issues that drive the high unemployment rates. Next slide, please. So in terms of the recommendations for this section, overall, the Commission supports government's decision to prioritize funding for social protection and economic development. We note, though, that we need to keep in mind the temporary nature of the increased funding for 2022-23, and be aware that in some instances, the additional funding allocated in 2022-23 will create future expenditure obligations in certain sectors. And should revenue not recover, these sectors will be under pressure over the rest of the MTF period. So we would advise departments to be aware of this potential threat and to be proactive in devising contingency plans to fund commitments should the need arise. We'd also like to emphasize the need for finalizing the new higher education funding model with haste. Next slide, please. So we've included a slide here on the second adjustments appropriation bill. And as noted in the slide, the aim of the second adjustments appropriation bill is to effect adjustments to the appropriation of money from the National Revenue Fund for expenditure that was approved in the 2021-22 financial year. So the total adjustments amount to 18.6 billion. The bulk of that is 18.1 billion is in respect of SASRIA to enable it to settle claims arising from the civil unrest that took place in July last year. The Commission agrees with the support provided to SASRIA as the payment of claims is important to support the recovery of businesses, especially your small and medium-sized enterprises who were hard hit by the unrest. The second amount relates to 500 million in respect of the Department of Health for the COVID-19 vaccine program. Again, here the Commission supports the spending as part of government's ongoing program to respond to and manage the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. That's the end of that section. If I may hand over to my colleague Thando, please.
Okay, over to you, Thando. Thank you, Ms. Peters.
Yes, thank you so much, Sasha, and good morning to you, Chair and honorable members. I'll be taking you, honorable members, through the last two sections of our presentation. So starting off with guarantees to state-owned companies. So on this slide, what you see is a table that shows SOEs, guarantees, and exposure as a percentage of GDP between 2017 and 2018, as well as 2021 and 22. So what's worth noting here is that Eskom guarantees and exposure as a percentage of GDP in particular is very high, but also just government guarantee and exposure to SOEs in general is very high and represent a risk to debt sustainability and public finances. So according to the 2022 budget, contingent liabilities will reach 1.17 trillion or 18.11% of GDP because of SOE's weak cash flows and tight borrowing conditions. What we note here is that the sharp rise in contingent liabilities results from high government guarantees, and by this we mean that contingent liabilities to SOEs account for half of total contingent liabilities, which is very, very high. And then the high guarantees to SOEs has a negative impact on government debt. Our analysis shows that if all SOE guarantee were to materialize, government debt will overshoot the 100% GDP, 100% of GDP mark, and that underscores the urgent need to reform SOEs and restructure them. If we can move to the next slide. So these slides show the financial performance of Eskom. So we assessed the financial health of Eskom, and we analyzed Eskom's assets, liabilities, and net and profit loss trends between 2017 and 21. So this particular graph here shows that Eskom liabilities have increased from 534 billion in 2017 to 667 billion in 2019, while Eskom's assets have decreased from 882 billion in 2020 to 782 billion in 2021. So what is worth noting is that Eskom also has posted successive net losses over this period, which peaked at a net loss of 20.9 billion in 2019. This then reflects a weak financial performance and a very delicate financial health position for Eskom. If we can move to the next slide. So we also conducted a similar exercise for Transnet and SAPC. So the figure on the left on this slide shows that that Transnet assets have declined from 369 billion in 2018 to 336 billion in 2021, while liabilities increased from 208 billion in 2017 to 213 billion in 2018. So what is worth noting here is that Transnet posted a net loss of 8.4 billion in 2021 after having maintained successive net profits between 2017 and 2020. So the figure on the right of this slide then shows that SABC liabilities have increased from 282 billion in 2017 to 384 billion in 2019. What is worth also noting is that SABC has consistently posted a net loss of for the past 5 years, and that the SAP net loss has reached 1.03 billion in 2017 before declining to 524 billion in 2021. What this tells us is that Transnet and SABC financial performance is weak, and that their financial position is very fragile. Can we move to the next slide? So after assessing the financial performance of these major SOEs, there are 3 points that are worth noting. The first one relates to the fact that the underperformance of SOEs is placing a heavy burden on the fiscals and highlights the need to address the root causes of their weak financial performance. The poor financial health of SOEs is also reflected in their deteriorating profitability and solvency ratios, which we've also telling the same story, that their financial health is very weak. And then thirdly, the Commission welcomes the initiatives by government to address these weaknesses, including, and we think this is important, the establishment of a centralized shareholder model for commercial SOEs, and as well as the publishing of a framework that will outline a clear criteria for government funding when it comes to SOEs. Next slide, please. So now moving on to the next theme, which is about public infrastructure investment. As honorable members will be aware, infrastructure investment is very critical for economic growth and development. So this graph shows that infrastructure investment trends between 2018 and 19 and 2024 and 25. So the trends on this slide show us that infrastructure investment has decreased from 260 billion in 2018 and 19 to 187 billion in 2019-20. Emphasizing the fact that okay, sorry about that. Just to add that infrastructure investment, however, increased to 249 billion in 2021-22. Next slide. So the graph on this slide, it shows us the share of infrastructure investment by the 3 spheres of government, as well as public entities, public-private partnership, and the SOEs. So what the graph shows us is that the share of infrastructure investment by the 3 spheres of government, as if I can just go over that again. So the first point that's worth noting from this graph is that in addition to the high shares of infrastructure investment by state-owned companies, the trends reflect that the share of public entities in infrastructure spending has also increased from 9.8% in 2021 to 13.6% in 2022-23, emphasizing the fact that government is increasingly relying on public entities and state-owned companies for infrastructure investment. Now, given the poor financial health of SOEs, as we've outlined in the above slides, the Commission is worried about return to investment of infrastructure program and its sustainability if the government is relying on this institution for infrastructure investment. The second point that is worth noting is that the share of local government in infrastructure investment is declining, and therefore the Commission is concerned that this is happening in the context of infrastructure backlogs in municipalities. Next slide. So, given the analysis above, the Commission makes the following recommendations. There are three of them. The first one is the fact that the Commission recommends that the government should assist the SOEs in order to appraise their profitable feasibility, operational efficiency, their track record in resolving market failures, as well as attaining development goals. The second recommendation is that government should harmonize the legislative framework for SOEs in order to remove legal ambiguity, reinforce implementation, and improve disclosure and reporting requirements. And then lastly, the Commission recommends that government must implement the necessary operational governance and financial reforms that will enable SOE to effectively and efficiently deliver infrastructure in order to realize a return to investment. And next slide. So as a Commission, we also looked at how government is balancing two aspects, balancing the recovery of the economy given the COVID-19 impact on one hand, and also the fiscal sustainability on the other hand. So in this regard, we note that overcoming COVID-19, protecting livelihoods and supporting business have been prioritized by the 22 budget. Also that the 22 budget has placed emphasis on social recovery, boosting consumption and investment, while simultaneously retaining expenditure on the economic function. So there is a need, in our view, to appreciate fully the bi-directional impact of these interventions in order to inform a future fiscal framework. Next slide. So we note that the composition of expenditure is not fully in the budget 22, is not fully aligned to the economic reconstruction and recovery plan. By way of example, the allocations to manufacturing incentives for products and systems development are projected to decrease by 9% over the MTF, yet these interventions are aimed at economic recovery. Secondly, if we consider the allocation to food security and agricultural reform programs, that particular allocation declines by 10.5%, yet according to the economic recovery and reconstruction plan, it aims to support labor-intensive sectors such as agriculture to achieve more inclusive growth. So also worth noting is that with regards to infrastructure, our analysis show that infrastructure spending is characterized by delivery and management deficiencies. So the Commission urges government to ensure that when it comes to things like the infrastructure fund, what is important is that as a key instrument for the ERRP to be implemented adequately, what must happen is that the implementation of the projects that falls within the infrastructure fund must be within the parameters of the IGFR instruments through equitable distribution of projects among different provinces. Next slide. So in terms of our recommendations, therefore, with regards to this particular theme, the Commission recommends that the budget process for 23-24 should focus on aligning the allocations to the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, informed by comprehensive budget and expenditure reviews. Chairperson, let me pause here then and hand over to our chairperson, who will go through who will conclude for us. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Ngozo. Over to you, Chairperson. Is Chairperson on the platform?
Apologies, Chair. I think there's some technical difficulties, if I may therefore take over in her stead of our chairperson. Thank you very much. So that is essentially our submission on this appropriation bill and special appropriation or second appropriation bill tabled today before you. Ultimately, we are recommending, we are in support of the bills. And though noting, of course, that in the changing environment and the uncertainties that lies ahead, our economy and fiscal and financial structures and foundations, threats are escalating, destabilizing our systems of the entire financial and fiscal nexus. And in terms of the appropriation bills and the expenditure items thereof, it is we consider it to be a well-balanced approach, although recommendations are still being made regarding how to improve, especially on the spending efficiencies, not just on spending, but actually the spending efficiency of what we get for the money that we spend. And that we believe that this is an approach that has to be constantly maintained and preserved, and so that it does not jeopardize the path to retaining and recovering our fiscal status and sustainability. We also applaud, as I said, the efforts and outcome associated with the attempts to stimulate growth. So it's basically how we look at both sides now, whilst protecting the lives and livelihood of our citizens, but also maintaining our fiscal sustainability. And we are going to do that within the context of even the deteriorating macro level and macro fiscal pictures. Unemployment is escalating beyond 35% now, and other challenges that are arising. And as I said, the economic outlook is not deteriorating. So regarding the process going forward and the social recovery, we believe that it's really all of it is that comes down to this economic reconstruction and recovery plan, and the implementation, I should add, to that effect, ensuring that infrastructure is rolled out. There should be no more of the sabotages that we sometimes hear and see. It's just must be just eliminated. Enough talk is enough talk. It's time to get through those challenges, and if need be, it is to be decisively eliminated. Localization through industrialization and food security, ultimately, in this such adverse environment, honorable chair members, is we have to do self-improvement. There's a war going on in the north. There's mistakes, we believe, in the policy environments, monetary policies, that's errors that are being made in other advanced economies. What do? We have to be self-reliant, self-improve, and self-strengthening of the South African economy. Thank you, Honourable Chair members, for today. We look forward to questions and comments. Thank you very much. I hand back.
Thank you, Team FFC, much appreciated. Can we now call upon Team PBO? It's led by Dr. Janchis. Over to you, PBO.
Good morning, Chairperson. Good morning, Honourable members. Thank you so much for the opportunity that you're giving us. I'm with the team on the platform. We'll take you through, I'll give you comments, and then the team will take you through the rest of the presentation. Siraj, you can move to the third slide, please. We can just start with the third slide. This is a presentation outline that we have today. Thank you so much. Next slide. I think this is just to highlight the importance of some of the areas that we're currently covering. Some is not clear. All right. Chairperson, apparently my sound is not okay. Can I just quickly clarify it? How is it now? I'll just speak louder.
It's
yes,
better now.
Is it better now? Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I was just saying that this in here, we're just showing some of the areas we're going to cover in the presentation. Next slide, please. I think, Chairperson and members, what we're trying to start here is to just try to give a context of which the appropriations was made, but also share our concerns from the FFC colleagues about how much the social and economic situation has deteriorated since the budget, and also emphasize the importance of how the budget has been over the years and how much it remains important for government spending in dealing with some of these measures going forward. I think we highlighted in this slide that the social protections and safety and security, some of the main largest expenditures in the national sphere of government, because the appropriation is largely focused on national sphere of government. We see that actually at around 13 million of children very reliant on social grant based on the population that we have, but also quite a number of old age people in South Africa are reliant on social grants as well. And quite much of the social development budget is really appropriate towards supporting social grants, supporting households in need in this regard. So it's very important to have this context in mind. That department is also expected to pay additional 18.6 million towards the social COVID-19 social grant in the current financial year. There's also new allocations taking into account that there has been extension of the social relief grant, which is allocated 44 billion until the end of next year. The next slide. But also the second part of the march of the national responsibilities lies within the police and justice system in particular, and we like to emphasize how much this is also important to be reflected in the spending thinking, particularly when you look at how much crime has increased over time by around 25% within the time that we looked at this analysis, but also looking at how much some of these social challenges affect different sector sites quite differently. We realize that some of the areas sites were more vulnerable, women are more actually affected by crime in this regard. Contact crime, we've seen a little bit of improvement in contact crime against children, but also still realize that it's still higher than what we've set ourselves as a target. So there's a need to ensure that there is protection of this spending in the medium term in this regard. The next slide. I think in the next slide, Chair members, I should give a quick next slide, please. Next slide. Am I not clear? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Who's moving our slides? Someone's moving our slides. It's not moving. I said to the next slide.
The host.
Yes.
Let me check.
Who's moving our slides? Otherwise, I can continue from my own notes in the meantime, just to avoid taking a lot of time.
While we're sorting that out, yeah, you can continue while and Babalo are attending to the problem.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. I do apologize about that. I think, is my video back on? Yes, my video's back on. I think in the next two slides, I was just going to talk about the global macroeconomic outlook, which has very much deteriorated since the budget has been presented in 2020 in February, and also highlight the issues around the ongoing disruption caused by the COVID-19 has increased global unemployment and negatively affected global outputs and value chains, negative effects of the climate change events, including extreme weather, causing suffering and negative impacts on global growth and inflation. Russian invasion and continued war in Ukraine has accelerated supply chain disruptions, increased global shortages and price of food and fuel. We've seen that a lot of that coming in. Strict lockdowns, protocols in some of the cities in major economies like China has negatively impacted its real GDP growth and further accelerating global supply chain disruptions. Much of the inflations, as our colleagues from the TIPS have noted, that much of international inflation's daily share is due to supply side of the economy, so supply chain difficulties. And therefore, household finances and poor investment levels globally still constrain demand. Therefore, interest rates, the question that we want to put in a discussion, like our colleagues in FFC, is whether the interest rate increase are really, a blunt instrument, which it's a concern that we have, that it is actually going to lead to it's a blunt instrument intervention. But particularly, we look at that developed countries have increased interest rates, but their real interest rate generally remains negative, indicating that at least for them, there is hopeful for soft lending. An example, you see that US Fed raised interest rate in May, but the real interest rate remains negative. ECB, also European Reserve Bank, has not increased the interest rate, and their nominal interest rate remains -5, and they have indicated that in July they will be starting the process of increasing their interest rate. Coming back to the African macroeconomic situation, from which this budget has to have taken that context into account, we look at that several constraints and add additional downward pressure to the key macroeconomic variables such as inequality, unemployment, and inflation and growth in this regard, particularly looking at what's the role of the continued fiscal consolidation in supporting economy and society, the latest resurgence of the COVID-19 infections that exaggerate ongoing impact, the impact of climate change, and severe weather events such as the adverse impact on health and education and economic activities of recent devastation in KZN in particular, but also the droughts in PE there, rise in unemployment rates that worsen sexual inequality, increased incidence of corruption, which also raises issue concerns around energy security and service delivery in that regard. Downward pressure on households, a great demand, which has been made worse by many of the...
I'm sorry, Dr. Janchi, is this the correct slide that it's showing on the screen?
Next slide. Yes, we're going to go to the next slide. Sorry.
Estelle, can you move to the next slide? Lubabalo is cut off again. He's trying to reconnect. What number is the slide that you're on?
Number 8. Just the next one from this one. Next one.
Okay, Estelle, can you move to the next one on slide 8 while Dr. Janji keep on presenting, because we do have on our gadgets the slides.
Yes, no, I was just also saying the last point was that some of the sectors of our economy, mostly the mining, may still benefit from the high commodity prices, but the global demand and price outlook remains quite uncertain in this regard. The last slide, Chair, the slide 9 lady, is also just to show how much the growth outlook has deteriorated when we've seen the Reserve Bank last week actually revised it downwards to 1.7 in this regard. But I think, Chair, what we're trying to say with this social and economic context, to understand the government spending within this context and how it has remained important and it's just to be seen as an important contributor in social and economic development going forward. I'll now give Dr. Orlando to take us forward with the next few slides. I see that we're still struggling to move the slides.
Dr. Can you share the rights, please? Can you allow Team PBO to share?
Hello, Chair.
Yes.
Hello,
yes, I can hear you.
I am back, Chair. I'm going to request that I make one of the PPO deputy directors a co-host, because, honestly, I don't know what happened with my network. Disconnected.
Yes. Make Dr. Mohammed to share that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Dr. Orlando will take us through, Chairperson. Sorry about that. Dr. Orlando will take us through the next slides, Chairperson. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Okay, Dr. Mohammed has been given the code right now. Thank you.
Siraj, are you able to continue with the movement of the slide?
Yes, I'm just trying to.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Nelia, please proceed. Thank you so much.
There's a dog barking, and also there was a request from our support team on media and communication that please, when you're speaking, members are requested to switch off the TVs and the radios because they are interfering with the broadcasting and the network. So there's that special request. I'm sorry, I should have requested you earlier, but I didn't want to interfere with the presenters. Please do that, honorable members and the colleagues, as you speak. Okay, who's coming?
Good morning.
Please proceed. Thank you so much.
Yes, good morning,
Okay,
honorable members.
Nella,
I will continue with the remainder of the appropriation slides. Just members, to answer the question whether the budget respond to policy priorities, the following is a few examples of how the budget really respond in terms of our priority to create jobs. 67 billion has been allocated for job creation programs, and also 18.4 billion is made available for the Presidential Employment Initiative. Initial funds have also been allocated for specific infrastructure projects, and they are listed on the table. Next slide. Also, members, a new business bounce back scheme will be launched this year to assist SMEs. And also just members, just to note in terms of land reform, the Agriculture and Land Reform Development Agency will be finalized this year. The Department of Public Works and Infrastructure will finalize the transfer of 14,000 hectares of state land to the Housing Development Agency. But members, what is important is that all these announcements and allocations are to ensure that it is we need to ensure that is reflected in the standard statutory documents of departments, which means it must be reflected in annual performance plans so that we can basically monitor and make sure and hold them accountable to spend and perform on these interventions that is basically announced by the President at the beginning of this financial year. Next slide. Next. The members, the table on this slide shows the numbers to be appropriated in relation to the already approved Division of Revenue Act. The total amount to be appropriated amounts to 1,959 billion. This amount excludes the provisional allocations and infrastructure fund not assigned to votes and the contingency reserve. The national allocation includes the total vote appropriated, which includes all the conditional grants except for the local government equitable share, which is a separate amount. The provincial allocation only includes the provincial equitable share, and the local equitable shares includes the local equitable share, and then which is included in the appropriations for vote 3, corporate governance. Other includes, amongst others, the fuel levy and the skills levy. Next slide. Members, the next two slides provide the appropriations by vote, including direct charges, which mainly affects the appropriations to the NT, the National Treasury, and the table also includes the changes since the previous financial year. So the total appropriations by vote amounts to 1,057 billion, and the direct charges amounts to 902 billion. The appropriations bill includes this aggregations per main division, which means it's the bill aggregates all the allocations in terms of the different budget programs, except for Parliament. Compensation of employees within current spending are specifically and exclusively appropriated, so it's only the committee that can approve any changes to the COE budgets.
Total increase since 2021-22 amounts to 149 billion. Some of the highlights in this table are in vote 3, corporate governance, which increased by 10.5 billion from 2021 to 2022. And the other highlight is the increase in higher education and training, which amounts to 14.5 billion. Next slide. One of the other main increases in this appropriations bill is to social development, which amounts to 52.8 billion, which basically is then transferred to SASSA for conditional grants. Next, for social grants, sorry. Next slide. Members, this table gives an indication of the structure of the appropriations bill. It shows the proportions appropriated for current payments and transfers and subsidies to national votes. In terms of the proportions, 17.3%, excluding direct charges, is allocated towards compensation of employees. Goods and services, on a national level, we spend 7.7% of the total appropriation. And in terms of transfers, we spend 69% of total appropriations, including direct charges on a national level. A few highlights are the votes that are driven by compensation of employees and transfers. We specifically mention the transfers because in many instances, it is the outputs of those transfers to those institutions that are required to address poverty, inequality, and growth that will improve employment. It is also found that the reporting on these outputs are not reflected in the department's ABPs. The reporting on the transfers are mainly either directly to the National Treasury or to Cabinet in many instances. So just to show a few, you can see the presidency and parliament is mainly driven by compensation of employees. Vote 3, corporate governance, mainly transfer, because it also includes the local government equitable share. Planning and monitoring, mainly driven by compensation. Public Service Commission, mainly compensation. And then you will see the departments that are mainly driven by transfers or public works, basic education, which includes all the conditional grants that are transferred to provinces, higher education transfers to higher educational institutions, and health also transfer 90% of their budget in terms of conditional grants to provinces. Next slide. A few highlights on this slide is for 26 military veterans. They are mainly driven by goods and services. The biggest proportion of the budget is spent on goods and services. And then the Office of the Chief Justice spent mainly on COE. And then there's a whole list of departments that mainly spend or mainly transfer their funds to other institutions. It includes human settlements, minerals, science and innovation, sports, arts and culture, and then also trade and industry and transport are mainly transferring their funding, their appropriations to other institutions to provide the services. Next slide. Members, during the engagement with National Treasury, a few questions were raised in terms of funding for disasters. The 2022 Appropriations Bill provides for emergencies in vote 3. You can see Municipal Disaster Response Grant amounts to 371 for this year. And there's also a Municipal Disaster Recovery Grant, which amounts to 26 million. And then in terms of agriculture, I couldn't find any disaggregation in terms of the cost for disasters, for flood or drought relief. I couldn't find the amounts in the appropriation bill for those two portions of the Comprehensive Agriculture Support Program. Next slide. In terms of vote 33, there's the Provincial Emergency Housing Grant amounting to 326 billion. Municipal Emergency Housing Grant is 175 million. And then provincial road maintenance, specifically for disaster relief, is 490 million. Next slide. Members, this illustration links to the conversation regarding the structure of government and the reforms. It specifically demonstrates the proportions allocated for Program 1 in different departments. So this is just a summary of the votes that appropriate more than 25% to administration. To note is that the smaller the department, the higher the proportion spent on administration. So in terms of the presidency, they spent 86% of the appropriation on administration. Another example is public service and administration. They spent 45%. The National School of Government spent 49% of the appropriation just on administration. And then the Civil Secretariat for the Police Services spent 45% of the total appropriation just on Program 1. Next slide. The highlights on the appropriations by economic classification includes the increase in the interest and rent on land by 12%. Then there is transfers to municipalities, increases by 11%. This is mainly in terms of the local government equitable share. And then households, transfers to households also increased by 10.5% in the 2022 appropriations. Next slide. So members, in the discussions with the National Treasury last week, members were also concerned about the adequate funding for compensation of employees. Members, the National Treasury guidelines for the costing of compensation of employees may not have allowed adequately for the wage agreements, and funds might be required for incorporation into the compensation ceiling over the 2022 medium term. What is included in the current allocations for compensation of employees are in terms of the cost of living adjustments for employees level 1 to 12. In 2022, there's zero provision made for that. There are provisions made for medical subsidies. In 2022, it's CPI plus 4.2%. And for housing allocations, the guideline suggests that departments increase that allocation by CPI in 2022. In terms of performance bonuses, no allocations or nothing has been provided. Escalation factors for senior management and middle management, no provision made. There's provision made of 1.5% for notch increases in government for compensation of employees. Departments are also expected to manage their headcounts within the allocated ceilings. Only critical and core service delivery posts should be prioritized within the allocated budget, and institutions are also expected to thoroughly explore strategies available for headcount management as provided in various circulars and policy documents issued by the DPSA. So in terms of the next slide, the table provides a summary of specific departments in terms of their COE budgets, and should also be evaluated in terms of the National Treasury guidelines. So I did the analysis, and this is just the extraction, a summary of some of the departments. So the total increase from 2021 to 2022 is 1.2%. The highest increase is in small business development. Their COE budget increased by 22.4%, but I didn't include the personnel numbers here, but the personnel numbers of small business increased from 219 to 272. The compensation in higher education and training increases by 15.6%, and their personnel numbers increased from 29,267 to 29,334. So it's a small increase, but a high increase in the COE numbers. But in this department, only 23,931 posts are basically funded in the establishment, and they also reflect in their budget that they have 213 positions additional to the establishment. In total, in the entire government on the national level, there are 2,940 positions additional to the national approved establishments. To be able to show an increase of 4.5% in the 2024 financial year, the perception is that the 2023 years had been reduced, just to show that the outer year has increased by 4.5%. Because if you remember, the outer year allows for a 4.5% increase in COE in terms of the Treasury guidelines. Just one or two examples. If you look at Home Affairs, increased by 4.5% from 2023 to 24, but the perception is that the 23 amount is not realistic if you compare that with the 2022 year. Their allocation is 3,883 million in 2022, then it reduces to 3,781 million, and then it increases by 4.5%. It's just an example to show that, and also to show or to try and establish whether the 2023 COE budgets are really credible. Another example is also in the police service. Their budget reduced from 79,137 million in 2022 to 77,232 in the 2023 financial year, and then increases to 81,608 million. So just to indicate that there might be a risk involved in the 2023 COE budgets as is currently over the medium term. Next slide. Just members, we've spoken about the additional funding, but adjustments to the main budget were made possible by an improved revenue outlook. Upward adjustments include compensation of employees, specifically for health, education, and police service. Other increases include transfers to municipalities and households. We've shown that on the table. But the increases to local government, however, does not guarantee that the needs of indigent households will be sufficiently met, especially if the systematic financial and operational challenges are not addressed. And we basically refer to the findings of the AG in terms of the financial statements. Public financial rules include that any new spending commitments, such as additional social protection, must be fully financed by tax measures or spending cuts, which basically implies that government will not borrow to fund new spending priorities. And any shortfall in revenue collection affecting expenditure will have to be absorbed within existing baselines, which means that departments will have to reprioritize within their own allocations. Next slide. Just over the medium term, members, not specifically to the 2022 appropriations bill, provision has been made for additional funding for social welfare, in health, education, infrastructure investment, peace and security, as well as a few others over the medium term. Thank you, members. I will hand over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Lydia. Sipetelo, just get in and quickly move on. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairperson and honorable members. I will take you through the contingent liability slide, support to SOEs and AGSA findings. Contingent liabilities refers to a state financial obligation that will result in an expenditure only if a specific event occurs in future. For an example, as indicated there, having to pay an SOE creditors of government guaranteed debt if SOE can pay that amount. So in essence, this means that materialization of the contingent liabilities places a significant pressure on public finances. It's diverting resources away from the spending priorities. That is, any further deterioration in the public finances due to spending pressures or due to materialization of the contingency liability could result in additional credit rating downgrade. It could increase the borrowing cost or crowding out of both the private and the public investment, and it could require the spending cuts elsewhere. That means it will harm the sustainability of the public finance. So it becomes more critical that government monitors and updates the contingent liability. This graph here just shows how over a decade the contingent liability have increased as a percentage share of the GDP. In 2011, they were about 342 billion, which has increased to 1.17 trillion in this current financial year. We can move to the next slide. The composition of the contingent liabilities are guarantees to the state-owned companies, guarantees to independent power producers, the guarantees to the public-private partnership, and the provision for multilateral institutions. So the guarantees to SOEs and the Road Accident Fund combined, they make about the 90% of the total contingent liabilities. So looking at the bottom left graph, we see that 40% of the contingent liabilities are guarantees to Road Accident Fund, followed by ESCOM. And looking into the bottom right graph, we see there it's the green bar, it's guarantees, and then the orange bar, it's other contingent liabilities. So 80% of that orange bar, other contingent liabilities, is made up of the road accident fund. So this road accident fund has increased, guarantees to road accident fund has increased from 54 billion in 2011 to 470 billion in the current financial year. We can move on to the next slide. Showing the support to the state-owned enterprises, the current appropriation bill proposes the appropriation of 23 billion to Department of Public Enterprise, which will be used to settle the government guaranteed debt. Mainly, this is going to ESCOM. 91.3% of the 23 billion is going to ESCOM, and then the 7.4% is going to SAA. As noted in the budget review, the government has allocated the military and aerospace equipment manufacturer, which is DENEL, 3 billion to cover the capital and the interest payment on the guaranteed debt, as well as the 22 billion, which has also been allocated to SASRIA. We can move on to the next slide. So the companies listed in the Schedule 2 of the Public Finance Management Act are intended to operate as sustainable businesses that generate profit and can borrow on the strength of their own balance sheet. So these companies, they have extensive borrowing powers compared to any other public entities. Looking into their financial statement, it shows that the financial position of the major state-owned companies, they remain under very severe pressure. And to meet the short-term obligation in the year 2020-2021, they had to defer their capital investment project. If we look into that table bottom there, it shows the first row, it's total assets. And in the 2020-2021, we see that the composition of assets, the asset base, it's decreased by 6.2%. And looking into the second row, which is total liabilities, they also it's decreased by 11.2%, which it has been increased over the years and only decreased in the 2020-2021 year. And this was due to the government equity injection that made the total liabilities to decrease in the 2020-21 financial year. But looking at the return on equity, it's 14.6%, which shows that they have a very negative return on their equity. It speaks to the standing of their financial position. We can move on to the next slide. This slide shows the financial health indicators at the department as the finding of the AGSA. It just summarizes, this is just a key snapshot. If we look into the table, a number of departments which had a deficit were about 50, and the amount it's amounted to 41.7 billion, and a number of departments which had a cash shortfall were about 89, and in the value it was about 33.3 billion rand. And in total, a total of 1.7 billion was lost to a fruitful and wasteful expenditure, and a significant amount of this, which is 64%, it was lost by the national government. And irregular expenditure reported in the financial statement also increased to 166 billion from 109 billion from the previous year. And a significant amount of this 166 billion was lost from the National Student Financial Aid, mainly due to the non-compliance with the bursary-related regulation. We can move on to the next slide. As our colleagues from FFC has indicated or spoken to the second adjustment appropriation bill, that the 18.6 billion, 18.1 of it, it's appropriated to National Treasury for SASRA, and the 500 million it's for the procurement of COVID-19 vaccine. Next slide. Yeah, this is our work, this is our analysis, and as the office will continue to do this analysis to support the work of the committee. I'll hand over to Dr. Jankis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chairperson. Thank you so much, colleagues. Thanks. I think the message that we are just taking on is last the closing comment, Chair, and members, is that the Appropriations Committee, Appropriations Bill is very important as a way that government uses support social and economic development. It's very important to understand that there has been a lot of developments since the budget was proposed in February, and hopefully our discussions and our input will inform the future discussions around how the appropriations should be taken into account. Thank you so much, members of Parliament and colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Team PBO, for the presentation. Secretariat will help me to identify members who want to engage with the both presentations. Honorable members, can you please show your interest by raising your hand so that I can recognize you? I see two hands for now. Honorable Ryder, you can kickstart.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good morning to yourself, to the colleagues, and a special thank you again to the presenters. I think both PBO and the FFC help us to do our work, and their time that goes into preparing these presentations is greatly appreciated, even when we disagree. Chair, thank you. So a couple of points I'd like to mention, please. The first one relates to the comments around the new funding model for education. Chairperson, I think this is less a question to the presenters than perhaps a request to yourself. There's a vast sum of money being pledged in the medium-term expenditure framework towards higher education. And a much smaller increase in basic education. Chair, I think we need to have this explained to us as the committee. I understand that Cabinet are the people that make these decisions, but they make it with our approval in terms of the budget. Excuse me. Chair, so there's obviously a plan in place for higher education to be the main point of focus going forward. I think that needs to be justified to us as a committee responsible for appropriations, because to my mind, intervening at the end of the education process makes less sense than intervening at the beginning of the process. And of course, with the provincial focus on education, I think as a House, this is important for us to get an understanding of. So Chair, if we can invite the departments of basic and higher education to come and present to us on their future plans, I think that would be important, and it's something that this committee should acquaint ourselves with, is what is the thinking behind it, and so on. So that's my first comment, please, and request, Chair. Next, infrastructure-led recovery. FFC, I noted your slide, thank you. Unfortunately, you showed percentages and not rand amounts. And yeah, my comment is just that the infrastructure-led recovery is almost entirely dependent on the private sector. And if you look at the rand amounts that the government is committing on this basis, it's actually very low. FFC, I'd love to hear your comment on COSATU, the threat of the 10% wage demand, and what that will do to this budget. I did note that the PBO had a small comment on that, but I do think it's important to hear from the FFC what your revaluation of that is. And then, of course, yeah, I'd also like to hear a comment about the special appropriation, particularly the 500 million rand that's being appropriated for vaccines, with a little bit less than 30% of the population having been vaccinated, and the take-up of further vaccinations coming to almost zero. Is this appropriate in your view? Yes, and then I was obviously pleased to hear the comment about policy coming from the FFC, and the fact that there are probably errors in policy, I think was the comment. Moving on to the PBO, thank you as well for your presentation. Again, enjoyed, thank you. And interesting point from Ms. Orlandi about the presidential promises and how those feed into the budget, and whether those get measured or not. And I think, yeah, it triggered me into thinking, it would be quite an interesting exercise to have a look how the President's annual State of the Nation address feeds into and I suppose the budget speech as well, then from the Finance Minister, how these feed into the actual workings of the budget once it is presented before us, how the measurements are then changed, or is there simply a cut and paste of KPAs and KPIs each year for the departments, and then perhaps a review look at how these things have been implemented. Stark warning about the lack of disaster planning and funding. I think that's something that we all need to take note of, especially considering the varied and fairly extreme disasters that this country has seen happening, almost of biblical proportions over the last couple of months, maybe years. Yeah, the lack of actual adequate planning, and the fact that our contingency reserve is so often plundered for other reasons. Which brings us on to the point about major SOEs. You clearly sparked on the issue around major SOEs. Excuse me. But yeah, I think that concerning as well as some of the minor SOEs that are starting to show signs of distress as well. And all those small little amounts, when one considers upwards of 700 SOEs, that I think all those little amounts can start to add up quite quickly. Big concern for me was the comment Mr. Similani made about departments having overdrafts. And I think that is actually, if not illegal, it's against regulations, if I'm not mistaken. 19% of departments have overdrafts. And I think that perhaps changes the image of the government's debt. Perhaps we can have a rand amount given to us, if that's available, please. I think that perhaps Treasury needs to take note of the fact. I'm sure they're already aware, but I do think perhaps we need to come down a little bit heavier on departments doing their own thing, raising their own finances, contrary to regulations as far as I'm aware. Thank you for the opportunity, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Ryder.
Thank you, Chairperson.
I've got one question to both FFC and PBO. First, let me acknowledge both presentations. My question is about it's on the SOEs. What strategic measures can be put in place by government to address the issues around poor and inefficient performance of the state-owned entities, which ultimately impact on public expenditure? This should bring financial and leadership stability in the SOE environment to ensure profitability. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Dr. Mletsani. Any other member? Okay, Honorable Detroit.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Honorable Chair, I just want to please have more information on slide 32 of PBO with regards to the 166 billion rand. If the presenters could just elaborate on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you, honorable members. Your participation is much appreciated. I just want to highlight on small issues. Having received and welcomed the presentation from both institutions, PBO and FFCC, I would like to hear your view in as far as the following is concerned. The question that I have, that what option does government have at its disposal to best table the over-increasing rate of debt service cost, which is, we know, is at 15.4%, and which will amount to more than 300 billion per year during this MTF. So my question is surrounding the increment in as far as the rate of the debt service cost. So I want to have a view which will, I think, will empower us. Sorry, I forgot to switch on the video. Thank you, Babalo, for reminding me. That will be appreciated. Your view in this regard will be appreciated. I also have another question, saying what is the view of the Commission, and the Commission meaning the FFC and the PBO with regard to the proposal replacement, the SRD grant with a permanent universal grant in relation to the fiscus. I think this question is something that we've been discussing in this committee, this grant, whether should it be permanent or not, the replacement, if there's a replacement, what kind of replacement. So I would also like to have your view in as far as the social relief grant, as to whether is this sustainable, and if it's not sustainable, what else can we recommend to government? I would like to check if there's any other member who wants to speak before I hand over to FFC.
Thank you, Chair, if I may proceed.
No other member. Dr. Cheng, you can come in.
Thank you, Chair, and it's missed, and my thesis is still hard in the works. When I get time to it. Thank you, Chair. Very great questions from yourself, Chair. I'd like to thank you for focusing our attention to these issues. The first is about what options does government have to control debt service cost, and I think the issue, and if we pull up our debt portfolio, you will see that fortunately and also unfortunately, and I'll explain why unfortunately, is that as you know, our debt portfolio is majority of which is like local debt, right? Domestic debt, raised in terms of rand denomination. However, we also have quite a bit of carry in terms or influence or sort of volatility coming from the foreign denominated debt. And worse off is that recently, due to COVID and also the junk rate and all the other movements in terms of the investment portfolio that is essentially government debt, is that it changed the currency denomination to from that of more diversified. We used to have Swedish krona, we had Japanese yen, we had British pound, sort of combination thereof, and then we call diversification, right? To that more of just US dollar denominated debt. And that is fortunate and or it was strategic, because at that time there was also the moving or the special loans that we managed to get from international organizations. And so it was of good rationale, shall I say, to sort of consolidate and because those international, those like the IMF and the World Bank debt are much lesser in terms of those debt service costs, right? It's like 1%, and some of them even have grace periods so invested in it. So it was all on good rationale. What can it do further? And going back to your question, Chair, Honourable Chair, is we call for a even more aggressive and active management of our debt portfolio, and not be too quick when it comes to, or in a rash manner, to raise further debt, of course. But active management, what that means is also to really focus our attention and pay careful attention to those rates and risk, because risk and returns are synonymous of the same thing in the investment terminology, that we pay attention to not taking on further risks and also higher rates of those debt. You remember that recently Eskom managed to raise or to essentially raise, I think, also quite a lot of billions of rands of debt through the bond market. The issue is not about how much people are willing to lend it. I'm bringing the example, Chair, to apply the rationale correctly to demonstrate what I mean by active management. So in fact, we had more people wanting to lend Eskom money than the market responded quite well. But that's not the point. Using active management of debt and of debt service costs into the practice is to look at how much is that debt and debt service cost is going to cost us. And I remember, I think I'm not wrong in remembering that I think it was over 10%. On the bonds and debts that Eskom incurs, which is admittedly quite high, and we see that as a risk taking on for escalating debt service cost. So these things, the best way ultimately is to try and search, not take on further debts and risks, And secondly is don't be distracted by how much these creditors are willing to lend us or any organization or the government for that matter, but rather really focus on that interest rate that we need to watch out very carefully for. Further, on the SRD grant with the Permanent Universal Grants, BIG, I guess, is ultimately the question is, what is the value of the BIG? Because 350, what exactly is the immediate term? I think impact is is quite solid, but the question is, what about medium to long term? And also what it would do if, say, regardless of the medium to long-term effects, and then we implement such a SRD or permanent support structure, but it breaks our bank, or it breaks the treasury, it breaks our financial and fiscal system to the point that there is then essentially the depreciation or the value deteriorates because the confidence flees and flights and that as the ultimate worry, I think, and this is where also the word sustainability comes in, is that today we are talking 350, but in say 5 years' time, if we have broken the financial and fiscal nexus and the systems and essentially it's escalating debt and goes into default. And essentially the rand depreciates because nobody wants to hold on to currencies that cannot fulfill its legal obligations of paying back debt. Then that 350 rand today is probably going to mean a lot less than 355 rand in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. Because of the collapse of the financial and fiscal systems. And so this is I think the trade-off that one has to think hard about in understanding what the fiscal impact is associated with such big, important, significant policy shifts. Notwithstanding that, there's also the impacts, dynamics that is of household consumption patterns, and also what that would mean in terms of if such a universal package is released. Yes, maybe immediately there would be an improvement, or at least food-wise, we hope. By the way, that is also part of consumption, but there just isn't sort of solid research done in that regard. And then in that vein, I want to just kind of give it a bit of preview, is that in a few days' time and at the end of May and also at our media briefing on the 2nd of June, we are due, that's the commission, we're due to table our annual submission for the 2023-24 division of revenue, where we do have on these two topics, Honourable Chair and members, one on the sustainability of debt and one on the consumption behaviour of social grant systems that we shall table just next week. So stay tuned, if I may. Then moving up, Honourable Moletsane, I couldn't agree with you more. So to add on that, I think, and we've been following the conversations happening at the Public Accounts Committee with ESCOM and reporting and of the key SOEs, and of course we also read the Zondo Commission Part 4, and I would like to raise an issue, or I'd like to raise an issue that is really close and to heart to me, is that we really have to start paying very careful attention to contracts. these contracts, especially that of multi-million, multi-year commitments, it would matter not because it's the real foundation of any business models. And quite often I see that the accounting officers or CEOs, of organizations battling, struggling, and trying to make changes, but still tying to these old, inefficient, non-value for money contracts. So especially for something like electricity, cold power generations, and those sort of supply of gas and supply of coal, and all those contracts, it must be reviewed, and if needs be, set it aside, and just so that it doesn't stay on the balance sheet for another 2 years and 3 years or another decade before we can maneuver and to get value for money for that for those commitments. Honourable Rider, COSATU 10%. The issue I think is when it comes to wage discussions, it's always the rates, it's itself important, but it's also what is underlying those rates. So 10%, okay, fine, but what is the arguments or the rationale supporting the 10%? And that is the question I think that needs to be answered, and that hasn't been or hasn't been discussed at the table. However, discussions regarding, say, inflation, right, cost of living adjustment aspect of it, that is well justified. But in that domain, regarding because the price of food and fuel and all those things are rising, therefore income should make certain adjustments to allow for cost of living adjustment. But as a commission, we remember in the last annual submission, we highlighted the fact that inflation is, yes, there's the headline inflation as one thing that all bargaining councils and arrangements, wage and employer-employee discussions take place, but it's more nuanced to take into account the non-core versus core inflation. There's a separation, and in our research we found that core inflation has increased substantially. It diverged. I wouldn't say it's substantially higher, but it was higher. But it's more worrisome that during all this COVID and all these disruptions in the supply chain and the world economy and that sort, and the war and so forth, it caused our inflation to diverge. And that means that when we enter into these discussions about wages, we should perhaps, and to make the conversation more accurate, to speak to the people and the workers, is to consider the core inflation rather than the headline, which has got non-core inflation associated with it. And so overall, though, 10%, it's obviously above what is budgeted for and what the fiscals can support. However, the amounts, if we look at it, if we're able to fix some of these SOE matters, and surely there's a lot of money that can be released from that domain. I mean, the irregularity amount, the non-compliance amounts of spending is in the hundreds of billions. I think it's time to also make better use of that money that is wasted, fruitless, and wasteful and irregular into something like this, on the wage, and also in terms of vaccine allocation. The trouble is that obviously these vaccines expire, and also there is the citizens' participation rate. I think where South Africa is at now, in terms of trends and infection rates that we see recently, I think we're not short on stock, but I think the campaign and the understanding thereof could perhaps be made more clearer. Specifically, some of the people may still be of the view that and not be vaccinated. And that is now going into the health domain, which I'm not an expert in, but I think it's just it's one side which we look at, right? Funding, how to get those vaccines available. But these things expire, so it's really important also on the pickup rate. The actual people wanting to get vaccinated. I think that's on the demand side, if you like. It could be of more an issue for this particular item for it to have to create value, to have real value. Thank you, Chair. I hope that answers. I hand back to you.
Chairperson, if I may, my name is Mukadi. I'm a commissioner of the FFC. I think Shen did not realize that I'm on the platform. And just to apologize once again on behalf of the FFC that the chairperson, Dr. Mbava, has not been able to rejoin us. It's unusual that this happens. There was a glitch initially, but normally she would be reconnected. Just then, Chairperson, if I may, to add on to the...
My apologies, Commissioner, on behalf of the Chairperson. I'm sorry for doing this. You are not visible, fully visible on the screen. We see you from the eyes, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I'm actually seeing the top of your head.
Apologies, Honourable Chair and members. Yes, the issue that was raised by Honourable Ryder, and though it was not really a question to either the FFC or the PBO, but it's just worth underlining, and it is that of higher education, the intention to hopefully, if it's adopted by the committee, to invite both basic education and higher education departments so that they can then clarify their plans. And this is very critical because in our recommendations, we did raise the issue that the increase in new entrants which would be catered by NSFAS would create a future expenditure and that would need to be met, and we don't really have guarantees that in terms of our budget, in terms of the current situation with regard to economic growth, whether we would be able to sustain that. So there is that risk that does exist, and similarly, the related risk is with regard to basic education, with in respect of the hiring of new teachers, and there's a need in terms of requirements by the department in terms of what we're suggesting and recommending, that they've got to have contingency plans. So in those meetings that would hopefully be held, it would be useful to really look into that. Added to the basic education is the issue of ECD that had now shifted from Department of Social Development into the Department of Basic Education. We've never had anything like this before, and it's a new experience for the department, which is already facing huge problems in terms of outcome and value output in terms of value for education or value for the rand. We know the big dropout rates in the primary schools and how very few make it eventually up to matric. So the system itself is under severe pressure, and now accommodating ECD, that would be an additional a huge factor that may have dire implications unless there's a proper planning for it. And that's our concern, that underlines the importance of basic education as very fundamental, and that more resources be put to it, so that if we get it right at the beginning, hopefully then at a university, although then there's still huge dropout rates, at least we would have given young people an opportunity to make it into the world of the economy. And then the other thing is, of course, added to that, which I recommend should also be considered by the committee in their meetings, is the issue of this new funding model for higher education for NSFAS, which hopefully would kick in the next year. But plans for that are still not brought to the light, and it would be critical that the sooner that happens, the better, because we know that it would really be a seriously contested arena of stakeholders that are involved, and it would be very helpful if that can be resolved at the level of the committee. The other issue I'd like to add on is raised by Honorable Moletsani. I think Shane had provided practical examples of how to deal with those inefficiencies that are there. And it's been a long problem coming through all the time, marred by corruption, fraud, and fiscal mismanagement. On our side, our contribution that would come hopefully later is that we are busy with a paper on corruption, and hopefully it would contribute towards reducing these fiscal leaks that continue to mar a public service. And therefore, when it is hopefully presented, it would contribute immensely to sensitize public servants and authorities into ensuring that we do manage that huge crisis that is developing and creating a very negative picture about South Africa. Then the other thing about, on the SOEs is that we, as a commission, we've already made our endorsement of the publishing of the criteria of the framework for government funding as an instrument that would hopefully help the SOEs to act together with the centralized shareholder model of funding. I hope that these two instruments would hopefully, if they are implemented correctly, would help contribute meaningfully to efficiency in the SOEs, which can then hopefully be more profitable and managed more efficiently. Thank you very much, Chair. These are just the few contributions I needed to make. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ndate Mukadi. Dr. Mukadi, is there anyone else from FFC who wants to? Anyone from FFC who wants to make more addition? None. Thank you for your responses, and the members will comment on the responses because we have a bit of time. Dr. Janji, PBO team.
Thank you so much, Chairperson, members, for the questions. Thank you so much. I think I'll start with the response comments on 3 issues. Then I'll give to Dr. Landi and Dr. Mohamed, and maybe Mr. Simelano will comment on the specific questions there. I think, Chair, my first point is around the issue on the fiscal space in relation to the debt service costs. I think what we have said, the need for more fiscal space for government to do more, achieve our objective. I think what we have said before, I remember 2020 discussion on tax proposals. We have actually proposed that there were sectors in the economy who have benefited a lot, who would have given an opportunity for additional tax imposed on those sectors compared to other sectors in the economy. And I think we've seen that even over the past 2 years, there are, globally also, there are sectors in the economy which have actually benefited a lot in the context of the benefiting, which raises opportunity for what they call it windfall taxes. There's a lot of opportunity for that. And I think that should be able to give more fiscal space for government to create more revenue and to deal with some of the concerns, particularly as we rightfully indicate the high level of debt costs that we have in our country. And also, I think the government had earlier proposed to raise more taxes in the economy. And I think, in our view, we haven't seen really a justification why that proposal dropped in particular. I think there has to be clear justification why this government dropped the proposal to increase more taxes in certain sectors of our economy, certain level of taxpayers. So there should be that opportunity for more taxes imposed within the context that we operate in. I think I'll leave it there. That certainly can create more fiscal space for government to create more revenue. And I think we're not unique. South Africa, many other countries are considering what they call it in the UK, windfall taxes. There are opportunities for that. And I think let's do highlight that in this regard. Coming back to the point of the subsidy grant and as policy instrument, I think the discussion around the subsidy grant, social support in this regard, we've seen how much this has been important contributed to support households, and also small business enterprises have benefited from some of the social relief grants. Clearly, that shows a need for more households as the social continue to deteriorate and going further. And I think for me, Chairperson, I have a sense that one or the other, there has to be some way of understanding this within the context of the South African Constitution. To say the Constitution has really said to us as South Africa, we should not have a country where there's so much high inequality, there's so much high poverty, and there's so much suffering in society. And if within that context we recognize the importance of such support that is government, and by the way, yesterday we were having a discussion about spending choices, and one of the points I've raised is how much government has actually supported many households, and that has actually led to more human development indicators actually improving for our country over a lot of times. And I think that's very important to actually take that within that context. And my concern, my worry, and I think I've said with the team as well, the discussion about this SRD or even the permanent grant of this nature in place, that in the public domain, in many of the mainstream media, it's been reported really as in a negative way. In a sense, there's a really clearly loaded economic perspective to this issue without providing broadly macroeconomic perspective or macroeconomic consideration of having such a policy or such a thinking within the side of the economy. And to many, at least, this should be seen as a part of economic policy. Yes, there are a lot of debates, in the mainstream, in the society, mainstreams, whether we can afford it as a country. And I understand it. And as I'm saying, the question is, that's really a loaded economic perspective thinking, because that really assumes that we can afford high level of poverty, we can afford high level of inequality, we can afford some of the sufferings that we have in society. As a result, we can afford to pay for it because we can afford having so much instability. Because having such high inequality, unemployment, poverty lead to a lot of instability, and that instability should be seen as actually instability for our economy as well as a whole. Even still, in 2021, I think in 2020, we had now analysts warned that stopping such grant would lead to some of the social instability just way before the July unrest had taken place. So there are certain conditions that we have to see within that context. And again, why am I saying we have to discuss this within the economic as an economic policy or looking at it from the macroeconomic perspective? Clearly, spending so much money in economy, it has to be seen a way of being part of economic development, leading to local economic to localization of economy, where you would require more production of food. That will lead to more employment. That would lead to more businesses being supported locally, even within economies. That should be seen, and more people will be hired, more people, and that also will provide more productivity. And that, for me, it doesn't come a strong debate about the consideration of this policy. And I'm saying there has to be some way of thinking that this could be a way of somehow having a permanent support to households in this thing is a policy in rethinking before. And last point around this, there is a tax issue coming. When you have more people spending money, there's a consumption tax. More people buying food, more people, there is a tax revenue that would come for government, even corporates, companies, and people getting employed. That would lead to more revenue generated for the economy. And I'm saying, yes, there will be at the initial stage a chunk of thinking how much they would have to additional money be spent, but that will really come back to the economy or to fiscus as a way of economic activities, but also a way of having tax being generated. But also the bigger side of it is how much it will provide support to households, reducing inequality, reduce poverty, and reduce sufferings that we expected to see going forward, looking how some of the macroeconomic conditions are spinning out. I think I want to leave it there, but there are, my view is that there has to be broadly seen as an economic policy as opposed to seen as expenditure, which we cannot afford. I think that's a misnomer in my view. This is economic policy should be seen in that light. The last point on social, before I give to colleagues comment, is around, I think when we look at our economic trajectory over the years since the 1994, we've seen actually that the time where we had a lot of growth in the economy is a time when SOEs and government had actually invested a lot in the economy, and that has to be seen in that context because, and I think there was a period of time where we've seen a lot of investment come from public corporations and government within the real investment, and I think I'm encouraged to see that there's more support given to SOEs to actually invest. And I think the issue of governance issues will have to be really investigated a lot. I understand the government has proposed measures to try and come up with a way of centralized governance or looking at how the OCs can be seen to achieve its development mandate. And my recommendation would to say the committee must really keep the government in check and that request further update on how to deal with some of these government matters. Chairperson, members, I'll stop there and I'll give Dr. Alam to come in, and Dr. Madu will also come in. Maybe I want him to also comment on the issues around inflation also and all that. Dr. Alam, do you want to come in? Thanks so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Director. Thank you. I will just respond to one question or one comment that Honourable Ryder made in terms of how quickly departments respond to new priorities or policy priorities or new interventions. That is actually a general issue in government, Honourable Ryder. It's not isolated just in terms of presidential priorities each year. We also find it with a medium-term strategic framework. There is a lot of interventions, new interventions identified with new performance indicators and targets. And then the medium-term strategic framework actually indicates that these things are funded through the medium-term budget. But when we try and find those indicators and targets within annual performance plans of specific departments, it's not reflected there. So it's very difficult then to monitor and make sure that those new interventions are actually achieved. So it is a general issue, and we are busy with an analysis of APPs versus what is currently new interventions within the medium-term strategic framework, and we will circulate those documents soon, as soon as we're done with them. So we can identify those departments that really does not quickly respond to new interventions and to make that change. Thank you, honourable members.
Thank you, Nelia. Any more addition, Dr. Janchis?
Yes, Dr. Modi will come in, Chair. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair, with your permission. Thank you, Chair.
Go on, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you very much. I'll come in to try to sort of pull together some of the issues, and my director has made, I think, some important points that I would have covered already, so I'll try to be brief, but I'll also try to be a bit methodical in our approach to this. I'll start with the question, sorry, got a bit of a frog in my throat. I'll start with the issue of SOEs and also this link to infrastructure spending and investment. I think in the long term, well, what I should say is we should take a longer term perspective to how we manage these. And I think one of the problems is we've been taking a short-term perspective on trying to manage our economy based on fiscal consolidation and trying to meet fiscal targets in terms of keeping the deficit low, keeping debt to GDP levels low, and worrying about those rather than looking at what we need to develop the economy and to build it so that it can actually sustain growth. And so for me, it's really important, as our director was saying, we need to revisit the meaning of what sustainability means. And one of the reasons why the United Nations, for instance, with so many governments around the world have come up with sustainable development goals is in response to this kind of short-termism and mainstream approach to sort of focusing on tools and intermediate targets rather than the final target, which is the people and how you actually support sustainability of their livelihoods and you recognize the problems that go with them and link very much to them is provision of basic services and investment in infrastructure. Now, the short-term perspective means that we sort of keep blaming the SOEs, and in many cases it's correct, but we're not looking at long-term solutions. And one of the reasons why, for instance, ESCOM is in such troubles, not only because of state capture and corruption and poor management in a short period of time, but there's been a collection of things over a period since 1994. The lack of investing in new capacity very early on in our democracy, and looking for independent power producers when there wasn't really that much interest. The ability to, focusing on keeping the mothball power stations in work, not dealing with the coal mines that were running out of coal and charging linked to contracts with the power stations. And so we need to, I think now, as part of the presidential infrastructure drive and long-term drive, start thinking about, where we need to be in terms of infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure, how we'll shift our energy composition, how we'll think about global climate change and all those, and then think about the money that we need to spend to do that. And we may find that we may actually need to spend more money, but in the long run, it will make our economy more sustainable and allow us to provide the services in a more sustainable way. And linked to that, the way we've actually allowed our SOEs to be run down and neglected over time, I worry that because we've allowed our taxes not to increase over time, we've actually we've been focusing for too long on keeping our taxes low and arguing that that is competitive. And in the process, we haven't actually been spending enough on provision of social services, on dealing with unemployment and inequality, etc. And so in a sense, the crisis that is looming in terms of growing inequality, the pressures of poverty, and if you add to that things like climate change, disasters like floods, and also pandemics, those things, we see our society, the bulk of people in our society living less sustainable lives. And so we need to also think about government spending and debt that we take on in those terms. And so this also brings me then to the SRD and making it permanent. My first point I want to make is that we have to be really careful about scaremongering. I don't know if a few years back we were all worried about what happens if South Africa loses its credit rating. There was a huge amount of scaremongering. The whole economy was going to collapse based on sovereign debt being downgraded. It's not a good thing that our credit rating has come down, by no means. But we've seen that we actually haven't had as serious an impact. It's something that we've had to manage. And one of the things I'm going to raise in response to the chair's question about how we keep our interest rates lower or our cost of debt lower isn't necessarily linked to reducing costs, but thinking about the measures we can do. And I think the director has pointed to taxes as one example, and I'll raise that as well. But back to the SRD, I think in terms of thinking about sustainability and what that means for our economy, for our people, for our economy to keep moving, that again is a long-term perspective issue. Now, there are many proposals around the SRD extension and the big that are budget neutral, and a lot of that includes things like increasing taxes. But there are also quite a few proposals out there that talk about increasing the deficit and debt and looking at the impacts of that on growth, and over time the economy growing because of increased expenditure that into especially poor homes that spend all their incomes on improving their livelihoods, but spending that money into the economy, also increase provision of basic services, improving people's lives, then creates economic activity in a local area, but also boosts economic activity in the economy as well, and also could help shift the structure of the South African economy away from being so dependent on the financial sector, short-term financial transactions, cross-border capital flows, that's where a lot of the money being made in the economies at the moment through speculative activities, and transforming the economy into one that supports growth based on the needs of the people, particularly the majority of people who are not that well off, not the 0.1% that are really well off. And so looking at growing our manufacturing and a more dynamic, diversified manufacturing base on the needs of people in terms of their consumption, their healthcare, more hospitals, more houses, more those kinds of things. And so the long-term thinking, I think, is really important. The big picture, rather than saying and scaremongering about South Africa going into this kind of a crisis or that kind of crisis and the rand collapsing, which we haven't seen. The most times we've seen the rand actually taking big dives has been because we haven't actually adequately controlled the movement of capital into and outside of South Africa. And that I'll make one point about that. So in terms of affordability, we really need to think, can we afford not to have an SRD, not only for poor people, but particularly for the poor struggling people in South Africa, but for the way in which we see the economy growing and transforming and developing a new sustainable growth and development path in the country. Then the question comes to the costs of debt and how we manage our debt levels. So the first point I want to make is over time, we need to grow the economy, and that allows us to take on more debt over time as the debt to GDP levels drop because the denominator GDP increases. In the short term, there are lots of things we can do. The first thing, and this is difficult, but it's the first two things are reduce waste and corruption and spend as efficiently as possible. And these we've been coming on for years and years and wanting to try that. And as I've said before in this committee and others, we may actually have to spend more money in the short term to be able to do that. And so we need to think about how we budget for that and make sure that we actually have good plans in place. The third one, as my director was saying, increased taxes, and he spoke about windfall taxes, and we're seeing commodities prices benefiting and commodity producers. We've seen large increases in profits in certain sectors, particularly in mining, and the notion of do we have a windfall tax when profits are above normal, when rents are very high in those kinds of sectors, and how do we do that? And that I think is worth having a discussion within society, but also for the executive to consider. The notion of a wealth tax is really important, I think, and there've been some really good work done by the Poverty Lab and Centers for Inequality, not only at the WITS, but other universities around the world that make a really good convincing case for a wealth tax, particularly on like the 0.1%, but looking at taxes on wealth and also on incomes of very high net worth individuals. Looking at more effective taxes on e-commerce, looking at a lot of yes, sorry.
I think round up to close. I see the chairperson. Yeah, just come up with the
I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, okay. I'll just make 2 more points. So there are also deductions that middle class and affluent households can get on pension funds and medical aid, and quite a few of the suggestions around financing and budget neutral extensions of SRD suggest looking at reducing those or getting rid of those. And then again, looking at corporate taxes, as my director said, particularly more taxes on capital gains and speculative activities in financial and real estate markets. Yeah, and so because of time, I've got a whole list of more things to go through, but also to say we should be looking at using the GPF and other parts of government's balance sheet, particularly where we're looking at huge volatility and uncertainty in the private markets, where lots of the pension fund money is invested, and to offer stable, positive returns to the public sector workers who are investing their money, and also hoping to support their families in the future and have a more sustainable future in South Africa, to provide them with that kind of security by saying you can actually support the government getting lower levels on its debt. And then also looking at the South African Reserve Bank entering into the sovereign debt market and thinking about how to strategically manage interest rates to keep them lower. So yeah, there are very many of those. If there is time, Chair, my director asked me to say something about inflation, but I think that we may be time constrained. I'll stop there and leave it to you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Team PBO. Are you done?
Frank is muted, but he's talking.
Dr. Danji, you're muted.
I do apologize. I was saying the last point come from Mr. Simelani about there was a specific question about shortfall on slide 32. Spetela, can I quickly respond to that? Thanks.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there was a question on the 166 billion of the unsettled claim against the State Department. These claims are made against the state, and these are claims that have not been settled yet, which can, by the court order or by the mutual agreement between the two parties. So the reporting department, they report on the estimated value of what will be the most likely outcome of the process. So there is a couple of departments that have unsettled claim against them. One of them is Department of Health, and their claim against Department of Health about 124 billion, which makes the 75% of the total claim against the state. So 124 billion is against the Department of Health, and these are claims for medical negligence. And the other department is the Department of Police, which is about 7.7 billion rand. And these claims are made against the wrongful arrest or the unlawfulness or unnecessary use of firearm, shooting, collision, or damages to the vehicles. And also the claims against the Department of Higher Education, which is about 5.1 billion. For a case lodged against the National Student Financial Aid and the Minister. And also there is a claim against the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, which is for legal services rendered by the Office of the State Attorney on behalf of the client department. So the claim against the Department of Health that have been unpaid by the end of the 2020-21 financial year, they are 124 billion, and they exceeded the operational budget for that year. So the Auditor General, they've noted that this claim by the department, the department tends to budget to pay the claim. They tend to pay the claim using the next year budget, which will hinder the service delivery of that particular budget. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chairperson. I think the discussion around the monetary policy as part of macroeconomic policy, we leave it for the Finance Committee, Chairperson. Thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Janchi. Team PBO and FFC, there's a follow-up from Honorable Ryder. I see your hand. Honorable Ryder.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Yeah, after that lecture, I'm not sure. Chair, yeah, sorry, I had intended to put my hand up much earlier. So really it's just a response to Mr. Tseng's comments on the divergence of core inflation and headline inflation. And I think it's an important issue, and the increasing divergence is important. And I was just wondering perhaps if the FFC have any opinions on the makeup of the inflation basket, and whether that needs to change, noting the changing spending patterns of South Africans. And I think as specifically as a reaction, first of all, to COVID, second of all, to the increasing unemployment, and of course now to the increasing costs of fuel, food, etc., as we move into an extremely difficult economic period. Is there a need to review the components of the inflation basket? And Chair, perhaps again, something that we need to learn more about as a committee, because I think many of our deliberations focus around issues around inflation and inflationary increases, etc. But perhaps an invite to Stats SA in the future. And I understand we've got a program that we worked out, but it's something to consider for future if we can flag that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Ryder. Anyone who wants to have a bite on the input by Honorable Ryder and the suggestions? No one.
Chair, if I may.
Okay.
Very short. Thank you, Honourable Chair and Honourable Ryder. Yeah, so I think it definitely more data is it's and the review of that basket is warranted, because admittedly, these things, consumption behaviour and people's households' consumption baskets does change quite significantly. So sometimes really it talks to the accuracy of the headline inflation that we see and reported every day or every month, but we talk about it and we definitely use it for our policy decisions. And further to that, I just also want to use the opportunity to say, so inflation we shall look into as a commission in research, looking more in particular at those item baskets. Basket items. And further to that is that we also, for the 23-24 annual submission coming next week, is also a chapter on looking at the public sector wage trend. So also just to add on to that, stay tuned for that just next week. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you again for today's engagement. Thank you very much.
FFC and PBO, I think we have come to the end of our engagement in as far as the presentations that you have made to the committee. And we want to welcome, and the members who have spoken have expressed their appreciation on the cooperation and the presentation. Our engagements are all the time welcomed and appreciated, because they help most of us to be empowered, to see things in a way that we couldn't see them before engaging with you. We really appreciate the work that you're doing, the inputs that you're bringing to, and your views to the committee, your understanding and unpacking of this appropriations bill that we are dealing with today. Thank you so much. You're always appreciated. We will now, honorable members, release Team
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you. We will release Team PBO and Team FFC, and members and the support staff will remain on the platform. We have the last item that we have to focus on now. The screen, I don't know what is happening. I see the small photo of Honorable Ryder within a big screen, but also a small, on the side, a small screen of the minutes. Can you fix that?
Jay, no, it's on your gadget. You'll need to switch views. There'll be a button that says swap video and shared screen under your view options.
No, it takes me to something else. Yeah, the standard one is working. Thank you, Honorable Ryder, much appreciated. I've pressed another one that worked for me. Thank you. We are now dealing with the minutes of the 18th. I think this is the set of the meeting that is outstanding from our side. 18th of May, 2022. Can we start with the first page, honorable members? I know we have received the minutes in time to can make corrections with the secretariat. Page 2. Page 4, sorry, 3. Okay. Next page. I'm trying to remove this. Okay, let's move. Honorable members, if there's anything that you want to change, you feel it's not representing the discussion, feel free to do so. Let's move, Lubabalo. I think it's Lubabalo, if not Estelle. Next page. That's the last page of the minutes on item number 5, is adjournment. Can I get a mover?
I move, Chairperson Eunice.
Thank you, Honorable Karim. Honorable Detroit?
Second, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Detroit, for seconding. So we agree that this minutes is a true reflection of the discussions of the 18th of May, 2022. Thank you very much, honorable members. We have come to the end of the meeting. Once more, let me pass my gratitude and my appreciation for your commitment, for being here, and the whips for being in another meeting and come back. Lubabalo, I see you have switched to your video on.
Oh, thank you, Chairperson, for reading my body language. Chair, I'm not sure if I'm not out of order, but I wanted to just indicate that next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, we have made administrative arrangement, myself and Kulego and Estelle, that the Select Committee on Finance will give us space so that Tuesday and Wednesday we join the Standing Committee on Appropriation and conduct joint public hearings on the two bills. We will start with the appropriation bill on the 31st. Then the following day, the focus will be on the special appropriation bill. However, the Standing Committee on Appropriations thereafter will have other items. For example, they will have to treasure the third quarter expenditure, but will be part of the public hearings, joint public hearings. Then the following week, we will give the Select Committee on Appropriations space to recover the day that they will donate to us and have a meeting for 2 consecutive days, Chair.
Select Committee on Finance.
Yes, Chairperson, a week after next week.
Okay. Honorable Detroit. Thank you, Lubabalo.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I just want to make a note, or the committee must just note, next week, Tuesday, we're only returning back from KZN from that oversight visit on Tuesday. So there's a possibility that I might not make that meeting, but we'll have to see how it plays out. Thank you.
Thank you. That is noted. Honorable Karen.
Oh, sorry, Chair. No, just to say that we have got no, as a Finance Committee, Select acknowledgement of our generosity in foregoing a meeting to the Select Committee on Appropriations. We're deeply disappointed that Lubabalo, as professional as he is, hasn't, nor is the Chair as good as you are, expressed your appreciation to us. We note that next time we're asked, we shall act appropriately. Or inappropriately, whatever.
Thank you, Honorable Karim. I know that the two committees, that they are just 2 in 1, and the advantage is that the chairpersons is you and me, and we have no choice but to work together with the understanding and the experience, the history that we have. So thanks Lubabalo and Nkululeko for being able to have that understanding. And I know that Nkululeko did not take the decision on his own. He consulted with you. Thanks very much for your generosity. And it's not for the first time, by the way, that this happened. We also had to do the same, and we'll keep on working together. Thanks very much, Honorable Member. On that high note from Honorable Karim, thank you. Keep up the good work, keep up the spirit and the cooperation. The meeting stands adjourned. Thank you. Malibongwe, ikamalaga Karim, Eunice.
Now you're getting overboard, Chairperson.
Baba. Baba.